Luma and the Night Bakery of Quiet Crusts. Luma came upon the bakery at an hour when streets turned to velvet and windows learned to glow like soft fruit, and the sign above the door showed a loaf painted with careful light, a picture so warm it seemed to steam a little even in the cool night. She nudged the door and the bell chimed once with the sweetness of a spoon touching china, and inside the air welcomed her with a bouquet of flour and warm yeast and a trace of orange peel breathing through sugar. Long wooden tables waited like friendly shores, their surfaces dusted with the pale weather of the day, and at the far wall an oven the size of a small room kept a mellow fire, its mouth an amber smile that never hurried. A baker with sleeves rolled and hair wrapped in linen greeted Luma with a nod that felt like a fresh loaf set upon a counter, and he invited her to sit upon a stool near the mixing trough where the first dough of the late night would begin to learn its body. The trough held water that remembered the river, and as the baker poured in a ladle of sourdough started the room acquired a gentle tang that made thoughts grow calm as if they had found a chair at last. He added flour in a soft rain, and the flour fell with the quiet of small birds landing on morning grass. Luma listened to the wooden spoon turning the mixture slowly until it formed a shaggy cloud, and then the spoon rested and the baker used his hands, folding and pressing with a rhythm that matched the low sigh of the oven draft. The dough answered like a creature pleased to be recognized, stretching politely then settling back, and with each fold it grew smoother as a pool that has decided to keep the wind for later. The baker smiled without looking up and said that every bowl of dough longs for patience more than strength, and that the room itself helps, for the beams remember many seasons of rising and the walls have learned to hold warmth as gently as a shawl. Luma breathed in the scent of grain opening and water agreeing, and the kneading became a song she did not need to name. The baker covered the bowl with linen as soft as clouds and let the dough rest, and during that rest he showed her the quiet geography of the bakery. There were baskets lined with cloth where loaves would later dream their shape, rattan spirals for round boule and long cradles for the loaves that preferred to be boats, and near the window a row of jars held seeds like patient constellations, sesame and poppy and flax and golden millet, each ready to add small stars of crunch to a crust that would hardly remember the stress of heat. In one corner a stone mill waited with its mouth closed, a pair of ancient discs that would wake before dawn to whisper grain into flour, and beside it a wooden bin kept sacks with friendly names, winter wheat, spelt with a smile, rye that liked quiet rain. A cat the color of brown sugar walked the ledge above the proofing shelf and blinked at Luma, then settled with the concentration of a guardian who believes in nap duty. The baker lifted another bowl and began a different dough, this one rich with milk and eggs and a thread of honey, and the smell opened like a window toward warm fields. He whisked butter until it shone like pale gold and folded it through the dough in generous turns that left the table gleaming faintly. Luma watched the layers become cousins, butter and dough learning each other, and the baker explained that lamination is a conversation that ends in a sigh of flaky tenderness, not a show, only a whisper that the mouth understands without thinking. The oven breathed, and somewhere a kettle set upon a small ring began to talk about water in a language made of small Soon notes. The first dough rose as slowly as the moon behind a curtain, and when the linen lifted the bowl showed a dome as smooth as a sleeping hill. The baker tipped it onto the table with a sound like a soft drum and invited Luma to flour her paws and help with the fold, one corner toward the center, then a turn, then another, and the dough accepted their care with grace. They shaped rounds and let them rest, then shaped again, gathering the skin so the loaf would remember how to be proud without pride. Each round settled into a basket where flour drew pale rings, and the room became a small universe of patient circles. Luma traced a spiral with a fingertip and felt the texture of rattan and cloth and fine flour telling the same story in 3 voices. The baker showed her a blade for scoring, its edge neat and shy, and he spoke of how a cut allows the loaf to open where it chooses and not where heat would force it, which felt to Luma like a lesson about kindness disguised as craft. While the baskets rested, they prepared trays of small rolls brushed with milk and sprinkled with seeds that chimed when they fell. The cat approved with a slow blink, and the oven sent a warmer breath, as if it had heard the plan for more bread. Night outside softened until the windows looked like bowls filled with dark tea, and the street gave a single sound of a bicycle passing, a bell half asleep. The baker and Luma shared slices of yesterday's loaf spread with plum jam that had chosen the color of dusk, and they drank warm barley tea from thick cups that looked as if they had been made by hands that love bread. She tasted the easy sweetness of grain and fruit and felt it move through her like a quiet lantern. When it was time for baking, the baker slid the first rounds onto a wooden peel, misted the oven with a cloud that rose like a polite ghost, and set the loaves upon the stone. The sound of the peel meeting the hearth was a sigh of welcome, and the oven took the loaves as a host takes coats at the door. In a few moments the crust began to sing, tiny crackles like winter leaves telling stories to one another, and that song threaded the room with joy that did not need to speak loudly. Luma stood near the oven and felt heat kiss her whiskers in a way that asked for nothing. She watched the loaves blossom along their gentle cuts, petals of dough becoming a crown, and the room smelled of roasted wheat and caramel and a memory of toffee that had never been rich enough to argue. The baker opened the door to turn the loaves, and a wave of warmth rolled out and placed itself softly upon every shelf and every jar. They baked trays of rolls that browned like small moons and a pan of buns curled with cinnamon and citrus where sugar had become a glass that would shatter into sweetness at the first bite. The baker set aside a few panes for mourning with little plaques pressed into their tops, names of families scrawled with dull chalk so the right people would find the right warmth later, and he dusted flour across the table again and began a rye dough that smelled of earth and rain and long stories. Between tasks he showed Luma the book where the bakery wrote its day, not only the number of loaves and the weight of flour, but also small sentences that remembered feelings, a very quiet evening with kind heat, a kettle that hummed nicely, a cat that kept watch over a basket of crescents, and every page carried a thumbprint of flour, as if the book itself earned its place on the bench. Luma turned a few pages and found the sketch of a river and a note about a miller who laughs like a loaf cracking as it cools, and she smiled at how the world had learned to place its best sounds in the right mouths. The baker invited her to brush loaves as they cooled, a gentle pass that swept flour into soft clouds and made the crust shine just enough to look awake. She listened to the cooling song, a faint tick and crack, a conversation between heat leaving and air arriving, and it seemed to her that the room carefully folded every sound into itself to save for later nights. A delivery of apples came from a neighbor who worked the late hours on the orchard edge, and the apples waited in wooden crates, a soft choir of friendly cylinders, and the baker sliced a few to stew with cinnamon and set them near the back of the oven where the air would keep the pot content. The scent wandered through the bakery like a calm story about trees. Luma helped stamp paper bags with a small emblem of a loaf surrounded by a wreath of grain, and each stamp left a circle that looked like a moon around bread, and she stacked the bags neatly so that morning would feel understood the moment it arrived. The cat changed position with the importance of a clock hand, and the kettle cleared its throat and made another small cloud for anyone who wanted the comfort of a cup. The baker poured warm milk over oats and honey in a bowl the size of a hat and stirred slowly until the oats settled like a field deciding to sleep. And he invited Luma to taste, and she did, and found that the spoon taught her tongue to move like a small boat on a smooth pond. He asked whether she would like to mark a signature on one of the loaves that had been shaped by her paws, and he passed her a stencil of a tiny fox. She dusted cocoa through the stencil and lifted it carefully, leaving her emblem on the gold of the crust, and she felt a pocket of joy open behind her ribs and rest there as if it had found a shelf with its name. They mixed dough for morning baguettes, though the word was never spoken, only long loaves that would carry air in sweet holes and a crisp skin that could remember a soft touch. The bench knife moved like a steady fin through the sea of dough, and the pieces rested like seals on a beach, then were rolled and set upon cloth that held their shape with the help of flour and kindness. Luma walked to the window and looked at the lane where night kept its gentlest promises. A moth visited the glass and considered the lamps, then changed its mind and made a small circle that looked like a thoughtful decision. She returned to the table in time to see the first great loaves come out of the oven entirely, round as planets with fault lines of light, and the baker tapped the bottoms lightly with a knuckle to listen for the hollow drum that said the crumb was ready to be revealed when morning asked. He placed the hot loaves on racks where the air could do its work, and the racks answered by giving each loaf a steady breeze that did not make a fuss. The baker showed Luma a bowl that held the bakery's oldest companion, the starter that lived and breathed and had been fed and cared for by hands now far away and also hands still working every night. He lifted the cloth and the surface bubbled with tiny greetings and a scent of apples and quiet vinegar, and he fed it with a spoon of flour and a trickle of water, and the mixture brightened as if it had heard a joke only it could understand. Luma peered into the bowl and greeted the bubbles the way one greets shy animals, and the starter replied with a plip that looked like a nod. They shaped small rolls with raisins and brushed them with egg so that they would wake with a glaze, and they set aside a few plain for those who liked their morning without shine. The apprentice arrived, a young person whose hands already kept time with dough, and they quietly tied an apron, washed, and began sweeping flour with a brush that made the bench gleam as if it were a lake catching dawn. Together they assembled trays for the first guests who would come in the early blue, placing cups on saucers and setting out knives that had learned how to cut without complaining. The cat tested each chair by warming it for exactly as long as a proper test requires, then marked one chair as exceptional by sleeping there for longer. Luma practiced scoring a long loaf with 3 gentle leaves, and the cuts opened with gratitude as soon as the loaf met heat. The oven took tray after tray with the serenity of a reader turning pages at an unhurried table. In a quiet hour before the city began to notice itself, the baker invited Luma to step outside to the small yard where crates rested and herbs grew in a row of clay pots. The night smelled of rosemary and damp stone and something like clean paper, and the sky wore a deep cloth of blue with one pale thread where morning considered its root. They sat on a step and shared a small piece torn from a cooling heel, and it was still so warm it asked for slow chewing, and each chew gave a new part of its voice, grain and smoke, and the tiniest sweetness. Luma felt her body soften along its edges the way a loaf relaxes as it leaves the oven. When they returned inside, the apprentice had shaped braids that shone softly under a coat of milk, and Luma brushed them with seeds that fell like light rain. The baker opened the lower chamber of the oven for pastries, and the room accepted the scent of butter and vanilla as a gift that did not need ceremony. They prepared a tray with small pots of jam, plum and apricot and quince, and a jar of honey that held late summer in amber. The bell at the door gave a trial ring as if warming its voice, and they lit a few more lamps and wiped a window until it reflected the bakery like a quiet painting and let the outside look in. Luma asked the baker which moment he liked best, and he said the second breath of a loaf after it is first cut, the moment when it realizes the work is done and it can be eaten, which sounded to Luma like the world at peace with being useful. She felt her own breath slow to match the rhythm of the many rises and rests she had watched, and the room seemed to nod along. The baker showed her how to fold parchment into little boats for custard, and together they poured cream that shivered like a pond in a quiet breeze, then grated the smallest veil of nutmeg and let the oven do what ovens do when they are loved. He placed a few loaves on a display, not as trophies but as invitations, and he tucked a sprig of thyme near the brown of a crust as if giving the loaf a friend to talk to. Luma wrote a tiny note on a card and slid it near her fox-marked loaf, a whisper for whoever would take it home: breathe kindly with this bread and it will breathe kindly with you. The first hint of morning pressed lightly against the glass and made the sign outside grow softer rather than brighter, as if the bakery knew how to welcome day without waking too fast. The bell finally sounded for a customer who did not rush, and the bakery greeted them with scents already rehearsed, warm grain and citrus, and a hope that was not loud. Luma stood to the side, content, feeling the room add her to its memory the way a recipe adds one more line. She thought of the lanes she would walk back through and of the small kitchen where a cup waited for steam, and she tucked the fox loaf into a cloth bag the baker offered, a bag that smelled faintly of flour and cinnamon and clean wood. She thanked the baker and the apprentice and the cat and even the oven with a small bow, and each returned the bow in its own language. Outside, the world had begun to draw its lighter lines, and the cool air sat upon her fur like a friendly hand. She walked slowly with the loaf tucked safe and the breathing practice of the bakery moving in her chest, in for 4 with the rise, rest for 2 with the hold, out for 6 with the fold, rest for 2 with the settling, a pattern as simple as water joining flour, and each step she took felt like a gentle shaping on a well-floured table. By the time she reached her door she was already full of the kind of rest that does not require sleep to begin, and when she entered her room she set the loaf on the sill and opened the window just enough to let a line of cool air meet the crumb of warm bread. She curled into her favorite shape and thought of baskets lined with linen and of the way dough opens where it is invited to open, and she understood again that kindness is a blade held at the right angle. The city made one last soft clatter far away, a wagon greeting a curb, and then the sound fell quiet. Luma closed her eyes and heard the oven in her memory sigh kindly heat over her, and she slept like a loaf that has finished rising, inside a room that knows how to wait for morning without asking it to hurry.